What happens when the people sworn to protect you break your lock, your night, and your certainty, then hand you the invoice for the privilege? What if the safest place you know is only safe until a siren mistakes your number? I used to believe that an address was a promise, a tiny geometry of numbers nailed to wood that told the world who I was and where safety could find me. And I want you to sit with that belief because you probably hold it too. On that night, when the sirens braided themselves into the dark like a bad thought you try to swallow, I watched them slow at the corner and then accelerate toward me as if recognition were a weapon. You would think protocol is a shield, but protocol is also a tunnel, and tunnels only go one way when the map is wrong. I stood behind the door that was about to become a theory of power, hearing the heavy boots arrange themselves on my porch like punctuation marks that turn a life sentence into an order. "Open up," the voice said, and it sounded like authority had borrowed a human throat, and I remember thinking how the timbre of certainty makes cowards out of questions. I managed barely to say that they had the wrong number, the wrong unit, the wrong person, but the battering ram did not speak arithmetic. Would split the way illusions split, cleanly, then everywhere, and the door became a memory while still attached to its hinges, which is how fast truth can be edited. I need you to understand that it was not just a door, it was the thin skin of 1,000 ordinary mornings. Coffee steam, keys in a dish, the boring liturgy of safety that makes civilization tolerable. They came in like a theory comes into a fragile classroom, confident, armored, allergic to nuance, and the first thing they did with their flashlights was turn my walls into suspects. Someone shouted a name that was not mine, and everyone behaved as if reality would eventually catch up to the paperwork, which is a kind of faith that breaks people. In the jittering light, I saw a photograph of my mother tilt on the hallway nail, and I swear it looked like she was wincing at the curriculum of fear we've all agreed to. "Hands where I can see them," an officer said, and I raised them like white flags that no one intends to honor. My living room inhaled and held it, the way a crowd does before a verdict, and then the radios crackled with the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. Wrong address. There was a pause, not an apology, more like a buffering wheel in the sky, and then the choreography reversed, holsters, nods, a clipped "ma'am," the floor giving my legs back one stutter at a time. This is where you expect accountability, but accountability is a door you knock on in daylight, and it does not answer after midnight. One of them set my broken door gently against the torn frame as if kindness could be arranged cosmetically, and a different voice told me a report would be filed, which is the lullaby paperwork sings to grief. When they left, they carried their certainty with them like a battery pack, and the silence they abandoned hummed with the aftertaste of authority. I stood in the wreckage composing a ritual, pick up the splinters, calm the dog, text the neighbor, breathe as if breath were a decision, try not to look at the thresholds which no longer remember being whole. The night air reached into the house with the casual intimacy of an ex who still has a key, and I understood that home is less a place than an agreement the world can break without notice. On screen, illusion. Because the illusion is that protection and precision travel together. The truth is that speed outruns accuracy when sirens are involved. You want a villain you can name, but systems prefer passive voice. And so the sentence becomes, "The door was breached," as if the wood had betrayed me by falling apart on its own. I called dispatch because I believed in the superstition that if you describe damage with enough detail, it becomes reversible, and a woman with a tired kindness in her vowels told me there would be a supervisor in the morning. Morning arrived like a verdict. Flat light, neighbors pretending their garbage bins were opera glasses, a draft stitching itself through the house and turning every room into a question. The supervisor walked my hallway like a cartographer of errors, agreed that mistakes had occurred, and offered me a reference number, which felt like being handed coordinates to an island that doesn't exist. I took pictures, angles, close-ups, a forensic romance with ruin. And as I clicked the shutter, I thought about Foucault's idea that power is capillary, that it seeps into tiny places like screw holes and policy memos and the distance between a hand and a holster. You may say, at least you're safe, but safety that arrives like this is a creditor, not a gift, and creditors always come back. I called my insurance, because that's what we're trained to do when the state borrows the wrong key, and the whole music sounded like a waiting room where the magazines judge your optimism. There was a moment, brief, embarrassing, when I tried to prop the ruined door back into the frame with duct tape. And I laughed the way people do at funerals when sanity needs a decoy. On screen, the truth is that I didn't yet know the second blow was coming, that institutions travel in packs, that my HOA would soon arrive in my inbox like a sermon about community while holding a bill like a blade. For now, fix your gaze on the splintered edge, and remember this. The first mistake was geographical, but the deeper injury was metaphysical, because what they broke was not only my door, but the treaty between attention and care that lets you sleep at night. Morning bled into afternoon when the email arrived, subject line chirping with suburban diplomacy, community incident, owner responsibility clarification. I opened it like a trapdoor opens, sudden, inevitable, with the sense that gravity had joined the Homeowners Association and learned my name. They thanked me for my commitment to neighborhood harmony, a phrase that felt like a smile that doesn't reach the eyes before it bit down, an itemized charge for the broken common gate, the scraped planter box, and associated security disruption. I read the words twice, then a third time, as if repetition could alchemize absurdity into sense, but nonsense is lead that refuses to become gold. According to them, the first responders had accessed the complex because a resident's door posed an obstruction to the emergency pathway, which is a beautifully inventive way to say my ruined threshold had the audacity to be where they chose to collide with reality. A number stared back, large enough to turn breath into an invoice, followed by the phrase, due upon receipt, which is bureaucratese for Neil. I thought about how communities are supposed to be quilts, warm and stitched together from our frayed pieces, and realized mine was more of a ledger wearing a sweater. The board's tone performed empathy the way a fire alarm performs music, loud, unwavering, and useless for comfort. As you know, per Section 8.4.7, damages arising from a resident's premises which precipitate community costs shall be assessed to said resident, it said, and I marveled at the way law can be trained to fetch for whomever holds the leash. I answered with the simplest truth that the police had the wrong address and attached photos, timestamps, the supervisor's reference number, a constellation of evidence that should have mapped a way out. Evidence, though, is only persuasive to those who aren't married to the conclusion, and the board and their conclusion had exchanged rings long ago. They replied that the proximate cause was my non-compliant door geometry, a phrase so preposterous I had to reread my own hinges like a crime scene. On screen, proximate cause fades into power cause. In that moment, I heard Hobbes whisper about leviathans and contracts, about how we trade freedoms for order until order trades us. I walked the courtyard and saw the scuffed gate, the tilted planter, the place where the battering ram had kissed the HOA's favorite ornament. And it struck me that aesthetic injury often outranks human harm in neighborhoods designed to look like brochures. A neighbor approached, eyes sympathetic, voice hushed, telling me this board plays hardball, and I wondered why the game always seems to be played with someone else's windows. That night, I printed the governing documents and spread them across my kitchen table like tarot cards that only predict fines. Non-compliant door geometry, I repeated to the empty room, and the fridge hummed the melody of appliances that have seen things and agreed to keep them cold. The rules were a labyrinth of shalls and accepts and hereinafters. Every corridor led to a minotaur wearing a lanyard. I drafted an appeal that sounded like a cross between a legal brief and a confession, explaining that the officer's mistake could not metastasize into my liability, citing sections about acts of third parties, and force majeure until the words themselves felt bruised. I pressed send and imagined my emails sliding down a chute into a room where power collects its souvenirs. Days passed in that specific slow way where clocks seem unionized against you, and every time an email pinged, I braced for either reprieve or another invoice wearing a different hat. When the reply arrived, it offered conditional leniency if I would agree to a payment plan and a formal acknowledgement that my unit had triggered the event, and I realized leniency is just a discount on surrender. On screen, illusion, choice, they offered me a choice between paying in installments or paying all at once, which is to say they offered me no choice at all. I considered calling a lawyer and then did, and the consultation felt like paying a toll to stand on a bridge that might be closed by the same people who sold me the ticket. He said we could fight, that words like proximate can be taught their manners, that negligence and causation do not shake hands just because a board says they do, and for a minute oxygen returned to the room. He also said it would cost, that justice and budget rarely double date, that even winning might look like not drowning rather than like breathing easy. Meanwhile, the temporary door I'd rigged rattled at night, and the rattle rhymed with the HOA's voice in my head saying community, 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 like a prayer that forgot the human it was praying for. I started filming everything: mail deliveries, maintenance visits, the gates, sulky hinge, because in a world of narratives, the camera has become our secular saint. On screen, slow crossfade to the bill total, then to my hands shaking. The number did not shrink under observation, and that is when I understood the deeper architecture. Systems extract not only money but acquiescence, converting hurt into precedent. So I told myself, and now I'm telling you, that the next move would not be obedience dressed as cooperation, but confrontation dressed as clarity, because sometimes the only way to honor a door is to refuse to be ushered through the wrong one. There comes a point when silence becomes complicity, and I realized mine had already been tallied in their ledger. I attended the next HOA meeting, the kind held in the fluorescent belly of a rented community room, where folding chairs groan under the weight of suburban morality plays. They sat at a long table like magistrates in polos, paper spread before them as if the law itself had RSVP'd. I stood, trembling but steady enough, and read from my notes, not merely my defense, but an indictment of the absurd theater we were all enrolled in. Wrong address, I said, the phrase ringing like a bell no one wanted to acknowledge, and I watched their eyes treat my certainty as a minor inconvenience. One board member, let's call him the keeper of bylaws, said, "We sympathize, but the community must be made whole," as though wholeness were a receipt you could staple to a scar. On screen, community must be made whole dissolves into community must be made obedient. I told them wholeness cannot be purchased at the expense of truth, but truth is never legal tender in rooms where order and convenience share a bed. The minutes recorded me as disruptive, which is the bureaucratic synonym for awake. I asked them how many more residents would pay for mistakes not their own, and their silence was the sound of walls rehearsing their indifference. My lawyer spoke next, steady as scaffolding, pointing out clauses they had pretended didn't exist, citing precedents where municipalities, not individuals, held responsibility for forced entries gone wrong. His words cut through the air like a metronome disciplining chaos, but the board smiles with a kind given at funerals, polite, temporary, certain the dirt will cover the coffin anyway. A woman from the audience, brave in her anonymity, stood and said, "This isn't right," and for a moment the room flickered with the rare light of solidarity. But solidarity is fragile when mortgage payments and social standing are the bricks that keep people upright. Soon, the air thickened with the quiet hostility of neighbors who fear that siding with you makes them next. I realized then that power's sharpest weapon is not the rulebook, but the fatigue it creates, the grinding certainty that resistance will cost more than compliance. On screen, fatigue. I could feel their strategy pressing down, paint me as hysterical, exaggerating, a footnote in their minutes rather than a headline in their conscience. So I shifted tactics, telling them about the door itself, how its splinters carried the smell of rain, how the sound of its collapse still echoed at night, how security is not decorative but sacred. Somewhere between metaphor and memory, I saw one of them look down at his hands, maybe ashamed, maybe just checking his watch. "Your governance," I said, "is not a covenant, it is a contract with teeth. And tonight you asked me to pay not for damage, but for the privilege of being mistaken." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that makes the floor creak like it's trying to walk away. They moved on to the next agenda item, sprinkler repairs, because power survives by pretending not to hear. But I had spoken, and the words were not mine alone anymore. They had seeded the air like spores waiting for cracks in the concrete. After the meeting, a man in the parking lot whispered, "Fight them! We're watching!" His voice was thin, but sometimes even thin voices hold torches. Driving home, I thought of Camus, who said rebellion is not only refusal but affirmation, and I wondered if affirmation could be built from duct tape, legal fees, and nights of fractured sleep. I recorded a video that night, speaking directly to the camera, not as a resident, but as a witness, because sometimes the world must see you bleed before it believes you were cut. On screen, close-up of my eyes, words appear, witness. Uploading it was an act of faith in strangers, that somewhere someone would understand the mathematics of injustice. Wrong address plus broken door should never equal resident pays. The views began to climb, comments pouring in, some outraged, some resigned, many sharing their own stories of being billed for the sins of systems. And that is when I knew this was bigger than a bill or a gate or a planter box. This was a rehearsal for how much we are willing to endure before naming endurance by its true name, submission. So I whispered to myself, and now I whisper to you. If resistance makes me the problem, then perhaps the problem is what the truth has been waiting for. The video I had uploaded, raw and unpolished, became an uninvited guest in living rooms I would never see. Strangers wrote comments that sounded like confessions, as if my broken door had unlocked 1,000 locked stories waiting for someone else to say it first. Same thing happened to me. They billed us for the fire hydrant. You're not crazy. These words stitched themselves into a quilt of rage, solidarity, and weary recognition. For the first time since the night of the breach, I felt less alone and yet more exposed because the internet is a mirror that both reflects and magnifies. News outlets sniffed at the story, some calling, some just scraping details into articles that made me both a victim and a headline, which is its own kind of captivity. On screen, victim dissolves into spectacle. Neighbors began to look at me differently, some with admiration, others with irritation, as if my fight were a leak in the ceiling dripping into their calm. The HOA responded not with humility but with escalation, sending letters that accused me of inciting unrest and endangering the community's reputation. It struck me how reputation often outweighs truth in the hierarchy of power, like a costume that matters more than the body beneath it. Lawyers reached out offering help. Some wanted payment, others wanted visibility, and I realized that even rescue comes with its own invoice. Still, I gathered allies, digital and physical, people who believed that accountability should not be selective, that doors are not disposable metaphors. One evening we held a small rally at the complex gate, holding candles, holding signs, holding on to the belief that light itself could be a rebuttal. The board looked down from their balconies, faces like statues that had forgotten what rain feels like, and I knew then that confrontation had escaped containment. A local reporter asked me if I regretted making it a scene, and I told her the scene was already written. I was just refusing to play the silent role. On screen, refusal behind closed doors. I cried, not from weakness, but from the weight of being turned into a symbol when all I ever wanted was a door that worked and a night without alarms. The HOA doubled down, threatening liens, threatening to reconsider my membership privileges, threatening everything but dialogue. Power, I realized, loves escalation because escalation disguises fragility. The louder the rule book, the weaker the reason it covers. Friends suggested compromise, but compromise tastes different when it requires you to swallow lies with a polite smile. I found myself quoting Baldwin aloud. The most dangerous creation of any society is the man who has nothing to lose. Because by then I had lost sleep, safety, savings, and what I had left was the one thing power can't digest: persistence. Videos kept rolling, not just mine, but others who used my story as a template, a rallying cry, a warning. In one clip, someone superimposed my broken door over images of gavel strikes, police lights, and HOA newsletters, and the result was both surreal and truer than any document I'd filed. On screen, rapid cuts, illusion, reputation, truth. The board tried silence as a strategy, hoping fatigue would do their work for them. But silence can be louder than speech when the cracks start showing. Journalists dug into their budgets, their histories, their pattern of fines and threats, and suddenly my little fight was a map of larger rot. The state representative's office sent me an email asking for details, and for the first time in months, the word oversight did not feel like a cruel joke. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact started to nod, then whisper, then stand beside me, as if courage had been contagious all along but required ignition. The HOA's legal counsel resigned mid-dispute. and the board's emails grew clipped, frantic, bureaucratic in the way of cornered animals. But more than that, something inside me shifted. I no longer wanted just to survive their bill. I wanted to expose the ledger itself, the architecture of exploitation dressed as community care. On screen, close-up of my face, voice trembling but steady, this was no longer about my door. It was about every illusion of safety we've bought with dues and silence, and how quickly it shatters under the weight of truth. And as I lay awake that night, I understood the climax was approaching, that the fight was less about who would pay for damage and more about whether truth itself could be invoiced. The hearing came not in a courtroom but in the Commons, a Wednesday evening where the air smelled like fresh mulch and old fear. The board had moved to a special session, which is how power tries to place felt lining inside its fist. My lawyer stood beside me, but I decided to speak first because a borrowed voice can't carry the weight of a broken threshold. I read the timeline like an incantation, dispatch logs, supervisor notes, photos of splinters that looked like nervous systems, the invoice with its cheerful malice. Then I set the papers down and told them the part the documents can't hold, the way night changes shape when your door becomes a hinge for strangers. I said I would not pay for their mistake, nor would I sign any acknowledgement that taught the future a lie about causation. The room tightened, a drawstring bag around a secret, and for a second I could hear the hum of the exit signs like mechanical breathing. The chair cleared his throat and began to recite policy, a rosary of sections and subsections, until the words lost edges and became a fog bank rolling toward truth. Community must be made whole, he repeated, but I answered that wholeness built on untruth is only camouflage for harm. A neighbor I barely knew spoke up to say that order without justice is the kind of quiet that grows mold. Another read aloud an email from the city confirming that forced entry liability belongs nowhere near my ledger. The board's counsel tried to object, but the word object sounded like a doorstop failing in slow motion. On screen, truth does not require permission. I told them the bill was not merely a number. It was a precedent that would teach every future mistake to send flowers to the wrong grave. That is when the camera phones rose, not as threats, but as witnesses, tiny lighthouses and shaking hands. The chair proposed a compromise, half the fee, a non-disparagement clause, a promise to end the spectacle, and the offer sat on the table like a clean knife. I said no, because peace bought with hush money always costs double when the lights come back on. My lawyer whispered that refusal was risky, but risk is what you take back from those who have been taxing your breath. On screen, risk reclaimed. I demanded a vote to rescind the charges, to issue a public correction, and to rebuild the door at their expense with an apology that contained verbs, not vagueness. The minutes clerk looked at me as if I had rearranged gravity. Then she began to type. They argued about optics, about budgets, about the danger of encouraging noncompliance, and for a moment I saw the wiring behind their smiles spark and smoke. The oldest board member, voice softer than the others, asked what I wanted beyond money, and I told him I wanted an end to the theology of fines masquerading as community. He asked what that looked like, and I said it looks like policy that puts people before planners, facts before face, truth before reputation. The vote finally came, and hands rose in staggered confession, 3-2, rescind and repair, with a statement acknowledging error and withdrawing all threats. There was no cheer, only a hush like the moment after a storm when roofs check themselves for missing shingles. I breathed, not triumph but oxygen, the kind you notice only after weeks of holding it under the tongue. The apology arrived 2 days later, unadorned and specific, and the contractor set a new door that fit like a sentence that finally found its period. I kept the largest splinter from the old door on my desk, a wooden reminder that the past stays sharp if you pretend it was dull. On screen, illusion fades into practice. I learned that communities are not illusions to be believed, but practices to be insisted upon daily, especially when they fail. I posted the outcome not for revenge, but for record, because victories that aren't written down get edited by rumor into something smaller. And to you I offer the harsh truth and the simple call to action. When the bill arrives for the damage caused by power's mistake, return it with interest and clarity, insist on names, dates, votes, and remedies, and do not pay with your silence ever again.